The first thing I noticed when the Uber turned onto Ridgemont Crescent was that my front step had been shoveled. Not just cleared, actually shoveled. The kind of job where someone goes back and salts the concrete afterward, where they get the corners and the little lip where the step meets the walkway. It was February in Guelph, Ontario, and it had snowed twice while I was gone, which I knew because my sister had texted me photos of the Weather Network app like that, was supposed to make me feel something. My front step was always the last thing on the block to get done. I'd lived there 3 years and I still hadn't bought a proper ice chipper. I was 31 years old. I worked for a geotechnical engineering firm that sent me out to remote sites for months at a time, drilling, soil sampling, logging cores, in places that didn't have cell service or coffee shops or anything resembling a reason to stay longer than you had to. I'd just come back from 11 weeks at a fly-in camp in northern Manitoba, the kind of place where the sun sets at 3:30 in the afternoon in December and everyone starts talking to themselves by week 4. My bag was heavy. My boots were worn through at the left heel. I hadn't slept properly in 2 days because the charter flight got canceled in Thompson, and I'd spent a night in a motel that smelled like carpet cleaner and old cigarettes. And my front step was clean. I stood there on the walkway for a second, longer than made sense, duffel over one shoulder, sight bag in the other hand, just looking at it. The rest of the block was a mess of half-shoveled pads and frozen tire ruts. Mine looked like someone's grandmother had come by with a ruler to measure the edges. I didn't know who'd done it. That's the thing I keep coming back to, even now. I stood there in the February dark at 4:30 in the afternoon, and my first real emotion upon returning home after 11 weeks was confusion. I went inside, turned the heat up from the 8 degrees I'd left it at, and stood in my kitchen in my coat because it takes a while for a house to remember it's supposed to be warm. I made tea with a bag I found at the back of the cupboard that had probably been there since the previous winter. I sat at the kitchen table and looked at the backyard through the sliding glass door, which needed new weather stripping. I'd been meaning to do it since October. There was a bird feeder out there hanging from the arm of a shepherd's hook I'd put up my first summer. It was full. I'd left it empty. I own this. I need to say it out loud so you understand the kind of person I was at that point in my life. I was not a bad person. I was just someone who had become very good at leaving. 3 years in that house and I still hadn't framed the prints I'd bought at the art market on Stone Road. I had 2 camping chairs in my living room because I kept meaning to buy a couch. I fed the birds in summer when I was around and forgot about them entirely for the 11 weeks I was gone because that was just the kind of gap I'd learned to leave in my attention. Someone had filled it. I didn't figure out who it was until the next morning. I was pulling my recycling bin back in from the curb. The city had come while I was gone and the bin had been sitting out there, probably for weeks, when the door of the townhouse next to mine opened and a woman came out with a coffee in one hand and a tote bag over her shoulder. She was maybe 28, 29. Dark hair pulled back. She was wearing a coat that was clearly not warm enough for February, but had the look of someone who'd made a decision about it and was sticking to it. She stopped when she saw me. "You're back," she said. Not "oh, hi" or "welcome home" or any of the things people say when they're trying to fill silence. Just, "You're back," like it was a fact she was confirming. "I am," I said. "How was it?" "Cold," I said. "Manitoba cold or just cold? What do you know about Manitoba?" She shrugged. "I grew up in Winnipeg," that introduced myself. She told me her name was Win. Win Beauchamp, pronounced like the French. She said it without being asked, which told me she'd said it 1,000 times in Ontario and had just decided to get it out of the way. She'd moved in 8 months ago. I'd been away for most of those 8 months, which is to say we'd been neighbors for most of a year, and this was genuinely the first real conversation we'd ever had. I asked about the step. She looked at me for a second like she was deciding whether to be direct or polite about it. She went with direct. "It's a safety thing," she said. "Someone slips on your step, it's your liability. I know because it happened to my landlord in Winnipeg. Big lawsuit. I figured it wasn't worth the risk. You shoveled my step because of liability. And I didn't want to look at it. You could have looked the other way." "I can't," she said. "I have a thing about it." She adjusted the tote on her shoulder and gave me the look of someone who has places to be. "The bird feeder. I hope that was okay." I noticed it was empty, and I had leftover sunflower seeds from my balcony planter. That was you too. I saw a chickadee just sitting on the hook looking confused, she said. I felt bad. I didn't know what to say to that. I think I said something like thanks, but I'm honestly not sure it came out as a full word. She nodded once, said it was nice to finally meet me, and walked to her car. I stood there with the recycling bin handle in my hand, watching her go, which is something I didn't fully register until she'd already turned the corner at the end of the street. I went back inside and drank the rest of my cold tea and thought about the fact that my neighbor had been keeping my bird feeder full and my front step clear, and I hadn't even known her name until this morning. She worked at a landscape architecture firm downtown, which I found out 3 days later when I ran into her in the parking area behind our units. She was loading samples into her car, little soil plugs in clear tubes, and I recognized the containers from my own kit in the back of my truck. Geotechnical? I said, pointing. She looked at the tubes. Landscape drainage study. You? Foundation work, mostly. Slope stability up north. Are those the same field? We both stab the ground for a living, I said. She laughed at that. It was quick and a little surprised, like it got away from her before she had time to decide whether it was funny. I liked it more than I probably should have. That was the beginning of it, really. Not a dramatic beginning, not the kind of beginning you'd point to later and say that was when everything changed. Just two people who stabbed the ground for a living, laughing in a parking lot in February. Over the next few weeks, I found reasons to be outside at the same time she was. I'm not proud of how calculated that sounds. It wasn't calculated. Exactly. I'd just noticed that she went out for a walk around 7:30 in the morning, and I happened to start walking at 7:30 in the morning. We fell into it gradually, the way you fall into anything when neither person wants to be the first to make it a thing. We talked about work mostly. She had opinions about urban tree canopy and stormwater management that she delivered with the confidence of someone who'd had to defend them at planning meetings. I told her about the North, about what it's actually like to spend 11 weeks in a fly-in camp, the specific texture of boredom that sets in after the first month, the way you start to find the small things important, the quality of the instant coffee, who gets the chair with the good lumbar support in the core shack, whether there are enough A batteries for your headlamp. You make it sound like a weird camping trip, she said one morning. It is a weird camping trip, I said, with drilling equipment and weather that's actively trying to kill you. Do you like it? I thought about it. I like coming home, I said, which wasn't an answer. Except that it was. She looked at me and didn't say anything, and we walked the rest of the block in quiet. March came. The snow pulled back unevenly, the way it always does in Guelph, patches of gray ice in the shadows, the sudden green of grass appearing on south-facing lawns like the ground. I got assigned another site, this one in northwestern BC, 6 weeks, starting in April. I told Wynn on a Thursday. We were standing in my kitchen. She'd come over because I'd mentioned I had leftover butter chicken from the place on Woolwich that does a full tray for $12, and she'd looked at me like I'd announced I had discovered something important about the universe, which told me she'd been eating badly and alone too. 6 weeks? She said. Give or take more or less? More, usually. She nodded. She was sitting across from me at the kitchen table with her fork in her hand, looking at the container of butter chicken, and she didn't say anything for long enough that I started to wonder if I'd done something wrong. I'll do your step, she said finally. You don't have to. Liability, she said. The snow's going to be gone by April, and the birds? When? I have extra seeds, she said. It's not a big deal. I looked at her. She looked back at me. There was something happening in that pause that neither of us wanted to name. The kind of thing where you both know and both decide at the same time that knowing isn't enough, that saying it out loud would change the shape of everything, and you're not ready for the shape to change. Okay, I said. Okay, she said. She finished her butter chicken. We talked about other things. She left around 9, and I stood at the kitchen window and watched the light go on in her unit next door, this window-shaped rectangle of warm yellow in the dark, and I thought, I have been leaving places my whole life, and I have never once stood at a window and thought about what I was leaving behind. I left in early April. The BC site was in a river valley about 40 kilometers from Terrace, Beautiful in the way that remote places are beautiful when you're driving in, and miserable in the way they're miserable when you've been there for 3 weeks. We were doing slope assessment for a road expansion project. The ground was saturated from snowmelt. We lost 2 days to equipment issues, and another day to a black bear that decided our core shack was interesting, which is the kind of sentence that sounds funny until you're the one trying to move a bear with a truck horn at 6 in the morning. Wynn texted me on the second week. Just a photo, no message. The bird feeder with 4 or 5 chickadees on it and a downy woodpecker on the side. I stared at it for a long time. I wrote back, "That woodpecker is going to destroy the feeder." She wrote, "He's renting, he has rights." I wrote, "He's going to cost me my damage deposit." She wrote, "You don't have a damage deposit, he's a bird." I put my phone down and went back to work. But I thought about it for the rest of the afternoon, which is not something I can say about most conversations in my life. She texted a few more times over the 6 weeks, never anything heavy. A photo of the first tulip that came up in her front planter. A question about whether I had a spare Phillips head screwdriver she could borrow. She was replacing an outlet cover. And when I told her I didn't have a spare but she could use mine, she said she'd already bought one. She just thought she should ask first. A picture of the butter chicken tray, empty, because she'd gone back and gotten it herself and finished it alone, which she described as a completely dignified experience. I told her it was. I thought about her more than I intended to. In the way that you think about someone when you're somewhere with no good reason to think about them, which makes the thinking feel louder than it actually is. I tried to be reasonable about it. We'd had maybe a dozen real conversations. We'd walked together a handful of mornings. She'd kept my bird feeder full. These are not the building blocks of anything except a decent neighborly relationship, and I was aware of that, and I kept being aware of it right up until the drive back from Terrace, sitting in the passenger seat of the company truck, while my colleague drove, and I watched the BC highway unspool behind us. And I thought, I want to see her. Not in a complicated way, not with any kind of plan attached. Just, I want to be back in that kitchen, at that table, with the butter chicken and the bad overhead light, and whatever it is she does with her hands when she's making a point, this small gesture where she touches the table with 2 fingers like she's measuring something. I wanted to be home. I got back on a Friday evening in late May. The days were long by then, 7:30, 8 o'clock, the sky still pulling blue at the edges when I pulled into the parking area. Got my bags out of the truck and stood there for a second, looking at my unit. The front planter had flowers in it. I didn't have a planter, I had the concrete box thing built into the front step. Most of the townhouses on the block had them. Mine had contained, for the 3 years I'd lived there, a quantity of dirt that I had never done anything with. Now it had what looked like petunias, purple and white, and some low green thing I didn't know the name of but which looked intentional. Like someone had thought about it. I stood there. The door of the unit next to mine opened. Wynn came out in a t-shirt and bare feet, holding a glass of water, and she stopped on her step when she saw me, and for a second neither of us said anything. Then she looked at the planter, and back at me, and she made this expression I can't fully describe, not quite embarrassed, not quite defiant, something in between, the look of someone who has done a thing they've decided to stand behind even if they're not totally sure about it anymore. I had leftover seedlings, she said, from the balcony planter, and the front box was just sitting there. You didn't ask. You weren't here to ask, she said, and it was a liability, a planting liability. Bare dirt is a slipping hazard, she said. In the rain. That's not a thing. I work in landscape architecture, she said. I'm pretty sure it's a thing. I looked at the planter again. Someone had put real thought into it. The heights, the colors, the way the low green border made the taller flowers look more on purpose. I knew she'd done it on a weekday after work, probably in the hour before dark, crouched on my front step with her hands in the dirt. It looks good, I said. She didn't say anything for a second. Then, how was BC? Wet, I said. Beautiful. A bear tried to steal our equipment. Did it succeed? Partial success, I said. Morally complicated outcome. She smiled. It got all the way to her eyes this time, which not all of her smiles did. I'd noticed that over the winter. Some of them were polite or quick or reflexive. This one was real. You hungry? I said. What do you have? Nothing, I said. I've been gone 7 weeks, but there's a place on Woolwich. I know the place on Woolwich, she said. Full tray, I said. $12. She looked at me for a moment. Then she went back inside to put shoes on. We ate at my kitchen table again. The overhead light was just as bad as before. She touched the table with 2 fingers when she was making a point, exactly like I'd remembered. At some point, she told me about a project she was working on, a wetland restoration along the Speed River, and she talked about it with this focused energy that made the room feel like there was more oxygen in it, and I thought, this is the thing. This right here. The way some people make a room feel like it has more oxygen. I didn't say that. I said, do you want the last of the rice? She said yes. Later, when we'd cleaned up and she was pulling on her jacket to go back next door, she paused at my kitchen door and looked at the backyard through the sliding glass door. The shepherd's hook was out there. The feeder was on it. I refilled it last week, she said. I saw the photo, the woodpecker's back. I figured. He's actually kind of beautiful, she said. The red on his head. Don't tell him that, I said. He'll get ideas. She laughed again, that quick surprised one, and opened the kitchen door and stepped out, and then turned around on my back step. It's good that you're home, she said. She said it simply. No drama, no weight behind it. Just a fact, the same way she'd said you're back in February. But it was different this time, and I think we both knew it. Yeah, I said. It is. She went back through the gap in the cedar hedge that separated our backyards, the one that had probably always been there but that I'd never walked through, and I stood at the sliding door for a while, watching the bird feeder in the long May evening light. I got another site assignment 3 weeks later, northern Alberta this time. 8 weeks, maybe 10. I told her on a Sunday morning. We'd started having coffee on one or the other of our back steps when the weather allowed. Not always, not every day, just when it worked out, which was often enough to feel like a habit without either of us having said it was one. She looked at her mug. 10 weeks, she said. Maybe 8, I said. You always say 8, she said. She was right. I did always say 8. I know, I said. She turned her mug in her hands. A cardinal had landed on the feeder, first one I'd seen all spring, and we both looked at it for a second without saying anything. Can I ask you something? She said. Yeah, when you're out there, she said. The camps, the drill sites, all of it. She paused. What do you come back for? I looked at her. She was looking at the cardinal. What do you mean? I said, even though I knew what she meant. People come back for things, she said. Or people. Usually. She stopped. Started again. I grew up in Winnipeg, right? My whole family is there. I moved here for work, and for the first 2 years I couldn't have told you a single thing that made me want to stay, and then slowly it started to be things. The river path. This coffee. The project on the Speed. She finally looked at me. I'm not asking you to stay. I'm just asking what it is. I thought about it. Really thought about it. The way you think about something when the answer actually matters. The bird feeder, I said. She looked at me. The step, I said. The planter. The butter chicken at that terrible table. I stopped. You. The word came out quieter than I intended, or maybe exactly as quiet as it needed to be. She looked at me for a long time. The cardinal sat on the feeder for another moment and then was gone. Okay, she said. Okay. You still have to go, she said. I know, and you'll probably be 10 weeks. Probably, I said. But you'll come back, she said. It wasn't a question, exactly. More like the beginning of a new kind of habit, the kind where you start saying a true thing out loud until it becomes something you're both sure of. I'll come back, I said. She nodded. She drank the last of her coffee. She looked out at the yard, at the empty hook where the cardinal had been, at the cedar hedge with its gap just wide enough for a person to step through. I'll keep the feeder full, she said. And I knew that she would.